Firstly, I'd like to thank Luca and Ivan for organising this workshop, and I look forward to discussing this paper later in the year. Just to note that there is attached to this YouTube channel, there is a link to a handout where a good deal of further evidence for the sort of argument I'm going to be making can be found. So, according to A.E. Zimmern, writing in 1924, Thucydides, alone among the Greeks of his generation, came to his war work with a scientific understanding of the early history of his country at his command, so that perhaps for the first time in the history of the human mind, he could place the events through which he was living in their setting of time and space. The time and space with which I'm interested here is suggested by my other epigraph from Zuleika Dobson, the great Oxford novel of 1911. Much was going on in Oxford in 1911 of interest to Thucydides' reception. There's the publication of Grundy's Thucydides and the History of His Age. Arnold Toynbee finishes his degree at Balliol, and a new student of Grundy arrives, Charles Cochrane, for a second BA, and Cochrane, of course, goes on to write a well-known book on Thucydides. The work I'm concerned with is the great masterpiece by Zimmern himself, The Greek Commonwealth. I want to fill a gap in an earlier discussion of mine on the reception of the Archaeology, a paper where I focused on its reception up to the middle of the 19th century in Hobbes, in Enlightenment theorists, in historians of ancient Greece, and in travellers. And I also looked at some strands in modern scholarship. This paper will explore the reception of the Archaeology in the early 20th century through the figure of Zimmern. I'll look at his use of the Archaeology in the Greek Commonwealth, his early masterpiece, and at his perceptions of Thucydides' intellectual affiliations with modern academic disciplines in the context of increasing disciplinary specialization and diversification in universities. So Zimmern himself, we see here, a couple of years before the publication of the Greek Commonwealth, when he was finishing his career as a tutor in ancient history at New College and launching himself on the career in the outside world, which I'll talk about a bit more later. And here we see his early engagement with the Archaeology. This is from 1896. Thucydides on tyrannies. We could take this strand forward through Zimmern's progress through the Oxford Classics course, Literae Humaniores, and on to his teaching. His very first lecture series in Oxford included as its very first lecture the fundamental conditions of Greek life, Thucydides 1:1-19. And this is his series, Some Landmarks in Greek History. We could trace the development of Zimmern's later lectures as he goes on to give lectures on Thucydides twice a week over the 8-week Oxford term. And we could trace as well some of the more detailed handouts that he provided for people attending those lectures. So here is a more detailed little booklet on the Archaeology, showing the scheme of early Greek history according to Thucydides, and it breaks up the argument of the Archaeology and provides some comment along the way. And this lecture material shows a broader engagement with Thucydides than is found in any of the published writings by Zimmern, as well as some specific links with his publications. At the same time, Zimmern's interest in diverse fields of inquiry emerges from those changing topics of his lectures at Oxford, which moved from canonical periods and authors to more diverse fields of study. Here we see the range of Greek history lectures on offer one term early in Zimmern's spell as a fellow, when, as you see, he is still a BA, has not yet passed 7 years from his matriculation. And here he's giving a period-based lecture. But as he goes on, he begins to lecture on things which are rather different from the topics of any of those other lectures, on topics such as slavery, the social problem in Greek history, slavery and free labour in Greece, the economics of the city-state. And the only other person who's giving lectures on anything like such ambitious topics is J.L. Myers, with whom he was in close contact. Now, this all leads up to the book he wrote after resigning his fellowship in Greece after travelling around the country for several months, the Greek Commonwealth. How does this engagement with Thucydides fit into this book? In the conclusion to the Greek Commonwealth, Zimmern presents the book as an introduction to Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War. We will leave Thucydides to tell the story to which this whole book has been an introduction. And this conception is reflected in the book's structure. 3 numbered parts, geography, politics and economics, are followed by a conclusion, that the single chapter on the Peloponnesian War. And in this final chapter, which takes its motto from the Stasis section, War as a Violent Teacher, Zimmern tells the story of the war down to the Median Dialogue and the departure of the Sicilian expedition, recounted in one pregnant sentence. 6 months after the sack of Milos, the great armada left port for Sicily. So by calling his book an introduction to Thucydides, an analogy is suggested with the Archaeology, which he refers to as Thucydides' introduction, and which, as we will see, he exploits especially in parts 2 and 3. At the same time, Zimmern makes repeated use of the funeral speech, presenting part 2, politics, as a commentary on the funeral speech. An unorthodox sort of commentary, but that's the word he uses all the same. The funeral speech continues to be a frequent point of reference in part 3, the epigraph of which, Philo kalumen met euteleas, we are lovers of beauty without extravagance, is picked up at the very end of that section. And the funeral speech supplies to the epigraphs to the first 3 chapters in the section Imperial Economics, which is part of part 3. The Greek Commonwealth is designed too as a commentary on and protreptic to modern Britain, both as democracy and as empire. At one point, Zimmern planned a successor volume, The Modern Commonwealth. Some more on this topic below, but it's not the focus of this paper. And it was his desire to engage beyond the academic study of ancient history and the university life that led Zimmern to resign his fellowship and go into civil service, working for the Board of Education and the Foreign Office during World War I, and then to return to academia in the context of international relations, following his own heavy involvement with the peace process and the formation of the League of Nations. Now, during the course of the Greek Commonwealth, Zimmern provides many explicit references to the Archaeology, giving it both praise as well as criticising some features, offering at points a sort of commentary on bits of it in footnotes. What I want to stress here is the broader image he extracts from it. he extracts an analysis of the spiritual and material development of Greece as marked by a contrast between the ages of the tyrants and the aftermath of the Persian Wars. So on the tyrants, he calls them an interlude. They did nothing noteworthy, a phrase taken from Thucydides, but they made no special contribution to the spiritual development of Greece. They brought no reinforcement either to the corporate sense of the community or to the liberty of the individual. And in the material sphere, too, they were felt to be an incubus. By contrast with this is the development after the Persian Wars, and here Zimmern translates part of the Archaeology, describing how the barbarian came over with his big armada, how in the hour of national danger the Lacedaemonians took charge of the Greek confederate forces. And I have underlined here on the PowerPoint some of the phrases where Zimmern seems to be importing that sense of spiritual development into Thucydides' account, the stress on nationhood, national feeling, as well as the idea of confederation, which is much stronger, more formal than anything in Thucydides' Greek. So he refers to the Greek forces as the confederates. And he concludes that this brief paragraph, carefully examined, is a full and sufficient introduction to the history of the Athenian Empire. It tells the tale of a great material change and a still greater spiritual transformation in the affairs of Greece. Now, a focus on national growth is also suggested by a comparison between the Archaeology and what was at that time the most famous book about the British Empire, J.R. Seeley's The Expansion of England from 1883. You see, this actually just is in one little footnote, and the footnotes are one of the memorable features of this book. Thucydides has nothing to say in his introduction about the crisis within 7th century Greece, and it's not part of his subject, nor does the author of The Expansion of England waste words on the misery of the Industrial Revolution. Now, this analogy with Seeley's famous work in one way takes him back right to his very first lecture series at Oxford, where he is telling his students to go off and, after his lecture on the Archaeology, to go off and read Seeley on the Expansion of England. And in focusing on what Thucydides leaves out, Zimmern is also picking up on a historiographical comment offered by Seeley at the very beginning of his work, when Seeley explicitly quotes Thucydides' Epitaphios, the funeral speech, the famous Philokalumen met Euteleas, which also, of course, appealed, as we've just seen, to Zimmern. When Seeley is talking about how Thucydides omitted events such as the philosophical career of Socrates or the artistic career of Phidias, and it's saying it's not the effect of any narrowness of view. Thucydides is alive to the unique glory of the city he describes, but it's just that that glory was the result of political causes, and so it's deliberately that he restricts himself. So Seeley, suggesting an analogy between his own work and Thucydides. Beyond that, Zimmern is surely suggesting an analogy with Seeley's focus on national growth. Seeley wrote that it's impossible that history of any states can be interesting unless it exhibits some sort of development. Seeley contrasted the relations between Greek cities and their colonies with those that exist between England and the dominions, while also adopting the ancient historiographical trope of the thalassocracy list. Seeley wrote that England begins now to draw ahead, and the thalassocratia of Holland terminates with that Greek noun written in the Greek font. Now, while Zimmern, as I said, offers an occasional commentary on the archaeology in his account of the development of the city-state, he concludes with his focus on the funeral speech, which he reads as enunciating a theory of imperialism. The Athenians had neither the leisure nor the desire, any more than 18th century Englishmen, to invent an imperial theory of their own, but Thucydides, writing when most of what was mortal in their work had already crumbled into dust, invented one for them. This theory has a material basis, but it's above all spiritual, based particularly on the sentence in the funeral speech when Pericles talks about we alone help others, not through a consideration of self-interest, but in the trust of freedom. Zimmern conveys this spiritual basis through the imagined voice of the dead rising from the Keramikos, the setting of the funeral speech. And then, after offering a translation of that speech, he closes part 2, politics, however, by returning to the material side of Athenian power, writing that the battle which Athens has now to face is not against the Lacedaemonians or any hosts of armoured men, but against a foe in her own household, the desires and ambitions she herself has nurtured. Now, just to return to the structure of the Greek Commonwealth, in part 3, Economics, Zimmern goes back in the section The Growing City to using the Archaeology, writing he's taking again Thucydides' 4-hour guide, translating and paraphrasing parts of it. But he also includes some pointed forward allusions to 5th century Athens, seen as perpetuating the old style of brigandage analysed by Thucydides. With chapter 7, Craftsmen and Workmen, Zimmern moves to a static analysis of economic basis of Athenian power, and allusions to the archaeology become rarer. But in the section Imperial Economics, he returns to the idea that, now dealing with the empire of the 5th century, he returns to the idea that the Athenian empire used, he says, the time-honoured expedient of state robbery, or again, old-fashioned buccaneering. He also revisits the funeral speech, stressing now its conservative focus on land soldiers and on defence of the land, rather than on the role of the navy, crucial to 5th century Athens. And he also picks up some observations on Thucydidean irony, which he had previously given in the footnotes to the funeral speech translation, pointing out how some of Pericles' claims are at odds with the context. So what Zimmern has done in structuring the work in this way is to separate politics and economics. The archaeology is used in part 2 as part of his analysis of the formation of the political community. This process culminates in the utopian depiction of Periclean Athens, the time when humankind has been happiest. Well, he acknowledges maybe that the men were happier than the women. At the same time, Zimmern repeatedly underscores the difficulty as well as the desirability of creating a modern version of Athenian citizenship. In part 3, the archaeology is used as part of Zimmern's analysis of the economic foundations of the formation of the political community and of the Athenian Empire. The process of growth required to create the conditions needed for the emergence of Periclean Athens cannot be contained. He writes that at the time the Greeks made the familiar mistake so natural to the Greek mind of regarding the city as a work of art. They did not stay to ask themselves why the forces which had cooperated to produce so desirable a result should consent to abate their vehemence and become trustworthy barriers against further changes. We moderns know to our cost that economic forces care nothing for social harmony or natural limits, that once unchanged, they are not easily arrested. At the same time, Zimmern hints at the possibility that the supposed Periclean theory of empire might have some purchase in the economic conditions of the modern world. Now, with this separation of politics and economics, I want, in the rest of this paper, and I'll return to the Greek Commonwealth at the end, to think about Zimmern's comments on disciplines and the formation of academic disciplines in relation to Thucydides. In a 1921 essay, Political Thought, Zimmern relates Thucydides' analytical methods in the Archaeology to a range of modern disciplines. You'll find in the opening chapters of Thucydides' book most of the sciences on which long modern treatises are written. You'll find something more. You'll find them blended into a unity. So let those who deny that Thucydides was a sociologist, let them reread Thucydides' account of the evolution, for it was an evolution that he saw and depicted, the evolution of Greek society from the earliest times to his own day. Let those who cry up anthropology examine into his treatment of legend and custom, and his power to use it as sociological evidence. Zimmern goes on to invoke geography. Let geographers refresh their minds by recalling those brilliant sallies in geographical thinking, in which he explained some of the features of early Greek settlement and city building. There is not one, he goes on, of the many movements which have sought to broaden out historical study in recent years, from Buckle and Leplay and Vidal de la Blache, down to the psychoanalysts of our own day and of tomorrow, who will not find in Thucydides some gleaming anticipation along the path of their own thought. So Zimmern here, his stress here contrasts with an antithesis commonly drawn between the breadth of Herodotus' interests and the narrowness of Thucydides'. That's something I've looked at in a recent article. Zimmern's analysis should be read against the development of disciplines in the modern academy and against his own intellectual development, including his decision to abandon a career as an ancient historian. His years as a tutor at New College were marked by debate both within and outside the university about the nature of the Oxford Classics course, about the range of degrees and subjects the university offered, and about the university's role in national life. Zimmern, along with older colleagues such as Gilbert Murray and Myers, was strongly involved in these debates on the side of reform. That Zimmern was, firstly, the world's first professor of international relations at Aberystwyth, 1919, and also very interested in Thucydides, has led to his being brought into modern accounts of the genealogy of the obsession with Thucydides in some areas of IR. But Zimmern's own positioning of Thucydides gains, as I say, from being read against the intellectual currents in his own time. And in what follows, I'll look very briefly at the figures Zimmern names as broadening the field of historical inquiry, and at the interlinked disciplines with which they were associated, and also at the role of classics and Oxford Classics in the development of these disciplines. So one figure he names is Thomas Henry Buckle, author in the mid-19th century of the history of civilization in England, the second chapter of which is a famous discussion of the historical impact of climate, food, and soil. And we can trace Zimmern's acquaintance with Buckle right back to his Greek history notebooks from Winchester College, and it's precisely this famous second chapter to which his attention was clearly being drawn. And you notice in his summary here of Buckle, presumably taken from his teacher, the headmaster, that Buckle distinguished between civilizations of soil and climate, a contrast between the East and the soil and the East having no educational qualities, whereas soil in England called out all the energy of men. So that's a familiar sort of environmental explanation of a contrast between Asia and Northwest Europe. The pages to which his notes refer contrast the tendencies of Asia, seen as infinite, imaginative, synthetic and deductive, with those of Europe, seen as finite, skeptical, analytical and inductive. Now, Buckle himself had no university connections, and while he wrote what's called a history, his search for universal laws strongly influenced the development of sociology as a discipline. Another figure Zimmern mentions, Vidal de la Plache, an important figure in the development of human geography in France. And he's someone who came from a classics background, wrote a doctorate on Herodes Atticus, became a professor of geography, and there he did, in his first year as a professor, a seminar on Thucydides in 1875. And in his inaugural lecture, he ended the very closing words by invoking Thucydides, the Pericles speaking about how it's man who possesses the earth, not the earth who possesses man. So that's a familiar bit of authorization of his discipline by allusion to this great Greek historian. And significant that Vidal de la Plache himself is writing in a significant French national educational context after the Franco-Prussian War, where the promotion of geography part of the kind of national educational program, and Vidal famous for his work on the regions, seeing these as all the regions as all part of France as a whole. Another of the figures that Zimmern mentions, Frédéric Laplay, was also with geographical interests and strong sociological interests too, very influential on some British sociologists like Patrick Geddes, for example. And Thucydides too was discussed in relation to this new discipline of sociology. Some writers saw an incipient interest in social phenomena in Herodotus, Hippocrates and Thucydides. Among them, for example, Auguste Comte, who was in fact the person who invented the word, not Herbert Spencer, as Zimmern claimed in the passage we were just looking at. Now, other sociologists like Spencer were a bit more dismissive of the Greek contribution, but discussions of Thucydides and sociology were also tied to debates on the disciplinary division between history and sociology, and also debates about different types of history, old history versus the so-called new history that emerged at the end of the 20th century. Zimmern himself had a strong interest in sociology, and which in Oxford it was sociology featured as one component within a new diploma for anthropology. And here you can see that he is discussing his interests in slavery under the heading sociology within this diploma in anthropology. And generally, the development of anthropology in Oxford was strongly linked with classics via figures such as R.R. Marriott and J.L. Myers. And within Britain, the development of sociology was also strongly linked with people emerging from an Oxford classics background, like Graham Wallis, Zimmern's old teacher, and also Hobhouse, the first professor of sociology at the LSE. Thucydides could be claimed as an anthropologist. A paper on the comparative method in anthropology by E.E. Sykes does this, developing an increasing explicitness in ancient anthropology. And anthropologists are also an important influence on the Greek Commonwealth. There was, of course, a much older exchange between what one might think of as anthropological writings and the writing of Greek history, but it's now that anthropology is being established as a specific discipline within the academy. Another discipline emerging is economic history, not named in that passage by Zimmern. In the Greek Commonwealth itself, he engages with Alfred Marshall, the most prominent economist in contemporary Britain. But I put here on the PowerPoint another example of the way in which Thucydides can structure the emergence of this discipline, in this case the emergence of economic history. The first professor in that at Oxford, G.N. Clarke, himself a product of the Oxford Lit Hum course. Zimmern mentions psychoanalysis as well, and interestingly in the Greek Commonwealth he engages with psychology via F.M. Cornford's Thucydides Mythhistoricus, talking about how Cornford shows how Diodotus at 345 transforms mythology into psychology. And that is really a rather misreading of Cornford, making it seem to be much more of a progressive move towards psychology, whereas for Cornford, that psychological model is a survival of pre-theological thought rather than a transformation into a modern discipline. And more generally, Cornford highlights differences between the incipient human sciences and Thucydides, where Zimmern stresses similarities. Now, Zimmern's treatment then of all these different disciplines points to a tension between increasing specialization, which he saw as valuable for the study of ancient history, and the unity or harmony which he sees in Thucydides, or more broadly in 5th century Athenian culture. And that's one important tension. Another lies in the opposition of dynamic and static analysis. And he wrote in an essay at one stage, he wrote in a book, Solon on Croesus, looking back on the Greek Commonwealth, how he at one stage planned something like a static analysis of the political economy of the city-state, but then thought that he would have to integrate a dynamic element too. And we can in fact see this in action if we look at Zimmern's manuscripts for the Greek Commonwealth. He actually changed it, not before he began writing, but he made the treatment more dynamic in the course of writing the work, and in so doing he made the archaeology of Thucydides more prominent. I've given here on this slide a contrast between the chapters in the part 3, economics, and in the published version. What happened is that Zimmern abandoned the structural position of private economics and city economics, which he set up through his discussion of Marshall at the beginning of the section, and he instead foregrounded growth. The chapter on warfare was moved from city economics to the growing city, and a chapter on colonization, of which no draft is contained in the Bodleian manuscript, was added. As well as this, key passages in the Greek Commonwealth that foreground the impossibility of stalling the process of economic growth were added, and also other later editions which are relevant to this include allusions to Montesquieu. So one can see then in the process of thinking that Zimmern put into the development of his work that he moved towards a structure where the archaeology became more prominent and posed more problems for the image of Periclean Athens he had created in part 2 on politics. So he gradually as I say, creates a kind of utopian image of 5th century Athens before undermining it progressively through the kind of insightful analysis of Thucydides, in part in the Archaeology. Now, I've only had time here to stretch a really much bigger argument in broad strokes. What I'd like to at least suggest is that Zimmern's engagement with Thucydides and the 5th century Greece more generally points to a typical tension between the canonical moment, seeing 5th century Athens as some great paradigm, a tension between that and the historicising in which he engages in part through the Archaeology. At the same time, his interest in disciplines could itself be read as a projection of his own career development, as he became dissatisfied quite early with life teaching Thucydides to privileged Oxford undergraduates, and went out into the wider world as among other things, a sociologist, someone who was doing social work. And his perception of this influence of Thucydides on the development of modern human sciences was also surely swayed by the sheer number of people who went from the Oxford degree, where they were meant to read all of Thucydides in the Greek, who used that as the basis for engagement in economics, sociology, all sorts of disciplines, anthropology, beyond the the narrow study of 5th century Greek history. So, as I say, there is much more detail on my handout, but I'd just like to thank again the organisers. I'll stop at this point. Thank you for listening.